My name is Dane, and I have the pleasure of serving as the current Vice President and incoming President of the Sustain Dane Board. I just wanted to pause and give a quick round of applause for our Sustain Dane team. They've done a really good job with the summit so far. Thanks for all your work. So I am really excited to be up here today to introduce our keynote speaker, Esha Chhabra. Esha is a writer and journalist focused on global development, the environment, and business. Her debut book, Working to Restore, was awarded Best Business Book of the Year, and it illuminates how businesses can join in on a new era of regeneration and restoration, and how businesses can do their work thoughtfully, consciously, and equitably. Her book is actually available for purchase outside these doors at the Room of One's Own table. So if you have not yet had a chance to do so, please, after the session, feel free to, at our next break, to check them out. So right now we are experiencing a lot of greenwashing. That is certainly really challenging, obviously, as a consumer, and it's hard to cut through the noise to really find those businesses that we can support that are doing the work to fight the climate crisis. Earlier today, we heard from local businesses in our communities and their efforts to address climate change and impact their community. So Esha will lead us through how regenerative companies are driving real change. She is going to share with us an exploration of what's possible and stories from around the world that are held by one common thread: a restorative approach to business. So with that, please join me in welcoming Esha Chhabra.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi everyone. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person. It's been a bit of a crazy 48 hours. I live in the city of Moorpark in California, and you may have seen on the news we had a huge wildfire break out yesterday, or actually the day before. And unfortunately, I was in the evacuation zone. So touch wood, our house is okay, but many others have lost their homes in the last 24 hours. And it just didn't feel right to leave at the time when we were, being asked to evacuate. So I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I hope that the next hour is helpful. And if there's anything that you find interesting and you want to continue the dialogue post today, please reach out to me online. The team has my contact and it's available to you all. Feel free to reach out. So I'll backtrack a little bit before I start in terms of who I am, what I do, and why I do it. So I started my career about 15 years ago writing and reporting about stories that I really felt like weren't getting the attention that they deserved. I went to Georgetown for undergrad, and I was in DC, and I was working at CNN, I was working at CBS Evening News in the days that people watch the evening news more. And I had the opportunity to run around DC getting news bites from all our political leaders and through various administrations. And I just realized that there were stories that I felt more powerful about, like more passionate about. And I thought, how do we get these stories onto the front page? We just were hearing more of like what's wrong with the world, what isn't working. And I'm like, no, there's people out there that are doing incredible work. And how do we highlight their stories? And through a series of circumstances and being introduced to a really incredible duo, David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg, who at the time were building something called the Solutions Journalism Network, which you can Google and look up today, and it still exists. And they have been training media people around the country and teaching them how to write about solutions, from editors to producers to journalists. And they had something at the New York Times, it was called the Fixes column, and it was like, how do we tell the stories of companies, social enterprises, nonprofits that have been able to create some kind of solutions to address environmental problems, social problems. And so I jumped on that bandwagon, and they became my mentors, and I started writing about solutions, and thankfully editors picked up my stories, and that became my beat. And then fast forward to 2017, when I was commissioned to write this book, actually. So it gives you an idea of how long it takes to put a book together. But I had seen the landscape shift. We had this rhetoric that was around social entrepreneurship, microfinance, corporate social responsibility. We had the Tom Shoes of the world, the buy one, give one. And I'd really seen movement beyond all of that. And sustainability had then come into the lexicon. And there were various debates as to how we all felt about that term. But there were companies that I was finding that really were doing the work. They were walking the walk, and they were really putting their money where their mouth is, basically. And I wanted to tell their stories. And I didn't see a book that captured case studies. And that's what Working to Restore is. It's a series of case studies across industries. So I look at food, fashion, travel, health, plastic waste, and just a multitude of areas, energy as well, to show that these kinds of businesses do exist, they are profitable, they can be successful, and they can be done, and what are the different paths that you can take. And so that's really what I'm going to explore in the next 35-40 minutes with you all, is just to show kind of like a sampling of it. But if you want to dive in, please do get a copy of the book and let me know what you think of it. So the first thing that I noticed was that these were people that were really thinking with a solutions lens. It was really, how do we create a business that solves a problem? It's not necessarily to just create another product to sell or create another service to sell, but it was looking at what is an environmental problem, what is a social problem, and can we build a business model around it? And what was interesting was when I went around and I interviewed all of these entrepreneurs, there's about 30 case studies in the book and many more that I've done through my reporting, the response that I got was, they said scale is kind of a troublesome word for us. Yes, we need to scale our businesses to a certain degree, but is the answer that we all need to be the next $50 billion brand like a Nike? Not necessarily. In fact, the world just needs a lot of medium-sized companies that embody these values. And in fact, if you look at the International Labour Organization, they estimate that there's over 400 million medium-sized businesses in the world, and that can be anywhere from 50 employees to 500 employees. And if those companies had a regenerative mindset or a sustainable mindset, that could really have an impact. And so I know every time COP comes around or Davos comes around, or these big conferences come around, we tend to kind of gravitate and focus all our attention on the big ones, the big companies. But there's so much potential for small businesses and medium-sized businesses to do this. And really the answer lies in replication of that model. So I'd love to dig in with you on what the word regenerative means. You may have heard this term, it's being used a lot these days. It really came into the lexicon around 2016, 2017, and it was really being used around agriculture. So regenerative agriculture really focuses on soil health. And if we use that analogy, the idea is that you're really bringing life into something. And if sustainability meant to kind of sustain the status quo, I think this was like sustainability 2.0, just kind of how do we level up and make it even better. And so regenerative is really looking at every layer of the company and how do you create impact. So these are some of the headlines you may be seeing. So the one in the top corner there about regenerative travel is from a travel magazine that we're looking at examples of regenerative travel. We all like to travel. Tourism is not going to die. How do we do it better? The one below that is from Vogue. It's about regenerative leadership in fashion. And there's a number of companies, Vivo Barefoot, which is actually in the book and that's highlighted there in the article as well, is really trying to be a regenerative business in fashion, and like, what does that mean even? And then the other one is from the New York Times, and that is about regenerative farming. And it's kind of a funny article. If you read it, there's a line in there that says, regenerative agriculture is like yoga, but for farmland, which I think is a bit of a stretch. But we can do a better definition of regenerative. So in the context of business, unlike in agriculture, what does regenerative business look like? I think B Corp is a good starting place, and I know many of you in the audience are familiar with B Corp and maybe B Corp certified. It's really thinking about every aspect of your business. So it's who you supply from, it's how you finance your company, who do you employ, how do you market your company, how much money are you putting into marketing versus operation costs. It's every aspect of the company. Are you helping people become owners of the company and sharing that wealth? So regenerative businesses are really trying to take it one step further. It's not just like corporate social responsibility or one project that you do off to the side, but how do you embed it into every aspect of your business when you're making decisions on a daily or weekly basis? So this is an example. I think everything comes to life when you see an example. What does it really look like? So this is a company that I came across years ago, and I've seen the growth of this company, and I feel like they really embody the regenerative mindset. You may have heard of it. It's become quite trendy in the last few years, actually. It's Veja, and Veja is a Portuguese word that means to look. And it was started by two Frenchmen, actually, Sebastian and Francois, almost 20 years ago now, and they started it with less than 15,000 euros. So that gives you idea that like this can be done, and you can bootstrap these companies if you really want to as well. But they were two Frenchmen who had worked for other brands that required global supply chains. They went and they saw those supply chains, and they were really frustrated with what they saw. They felt like the social standards were not there, the environmental standards were not being respected, and they were children of the 80s, and they thought, like, can we build a shoe brand, everybody likes sneakers, that does it differently than the big brands of the world. And so they set out to build Veja in Brazil. Now, what's crazy about this is most fashion companies, as I'm sure many of you in the audience know, is that you're taking a material from one place, you're sending it to a mill that's in another country, then you're sending it to a cut and sew facility, which is in another country, then you're putting it onto containers, and then it's being trucked over or shipped over to a facility for storage where you do 3PL, and then it's shipped out to the customer, and that's just a massive footprint. And so they thought, well, how do we do this all in one country? And which country has everything that we need, and we feel like we could make this work? And so they settled on Brazil. And so they work in Brazil to get the cotton from the northern part of Brazil. Then they get the rubber from the Amazon, and then they manufacture the shoe in the southern part of Brazil in a town called Porto Alegre, which is on the Uruguay border. And then all of it is sent in one go, the finished product, by sea to their fulfillment center, which is outside of Paris. And that fulfillment center is actually run by a nonprofit where they hire people that come from a variety of backgrounds that might be considered unemployable. These might be folks from marginalized communities. This might be people who have a criminal record and they're not considered employable by other businesses. And they work with them and help them create a career for themselves. All of this has been bootstrapped. They haven't taken on money. And in fact, to make their shoes, it costs almost 5 times more. But the way that they can do that is because they've put money into the manufacturing, and they've not put money into marketing. One of their big things is like, we don't really want to spend a lot of money on just athletes and models and influencers wearing our product. We really want to put that money into the people that make our brand. So I want to share with you, I had the opportunity to go down to Brazil and see their supply chain, and the rubber aspect of it is actually really interesting. So here are some of their designs. You can see this is one of their popular designs. They have one that also uses a cotton upper, which you'll see here in a minute. But this is what it looks like. You go down to Brazil through a series of drives. You finally get down to the region where they source the rubber from. You take a boat across the river, and you end up in a community that looks much like this. And this is where the seringueiros, which is the Portuguese word for rubber tappers, live in these homes. And you can see these trees that surround them. Now, for Veja, what was important was, how do we keep these trees upright? And as many of you may have heard and seen, there's a lot of deforestation that's going on in the Amazon. And it is more lucrative for people who live there locally to, partake in that. Whether it's in the cattle industry or in the timber industry, they can make more money. And so Veja was like, wait, hold on. How do we help them make money tapping the trees for rubber? And this doesn't damage the tree. You don't have to cut the tree. It can, go on for 20, 30 years, easily producing rubber. And it's a very ecological process, but there wasn't an economy around it. So they hired a local team, they worked with some local experts, and they said, let's create an economy so that in 5 years' time or so, these seringueiros will be able to tap rubber, collect the rubber, and make more money doing this than they would doing timber or cattle. And it's really been a work in progress, lots of ups and downs, as you can imagine. It's not easy to do this work, but this is what it looks like. You can kind of think of it in the way of, tapping trees for maple syrup or so, but the rubber comes down the tree after it's scratched like this, and it's collected in these containers, and then it hardens. And then you can turn it into the sole of a shoe. And these are the gentlemen, when I went down there, they were having a sort of town hall discussing their businesses and all of that, their challenges that they were facing at that time. And so this is what the finished rubber looks like. And then it's taken to their facility in Porto Alegre, where it's flattened and is turned into the sole of a shoe. It's a remarkable example of actually carbon insetting before it was even a term or a trend or a thing, because Veja has been around for almost 20 years and they've been doing this for more than a decade. And so it was a great example of how your business practices can have such an incredible social and environmental impact and be really a core part of the business. So this is the factory. They turn it into, the shoes down there, and you can see here there's the cotton, which is another remarkable story that comes from the northern part of Brazil, and they use organic cotton. They helped farmers there transition to a more agroecological way of farming, that they could produce organic cotton at competitive prices. And then the rubber from the Amazon, and then it's sent to this facility outside of Paris, which has grown massively. And they employ people that come from a nonprofit and help give them sort of a second career. And Veja is now at an annual turnover of about 250 to 300 million. So it is happening at scale. And that is something that I know that is often a discussion, is like, yeah, we can do a really tiny business with this, but can we make something that really employs a significant number of people? Yes, but when you think about it, like 250 million people, $250 million versus Nike's 50 billion is still much smaller. So scale is something to be thinking about as you're looking at these examples. But I'd love to share with you this short clip. It will only take 5 minutes of some footage that I shot when I was down in the Amazon.
We started thinking about what kind of products we buy, what kind of society we live in, what is capitalism, what could be capitalism. We wanted to create a product that was different, that was made differently, with a lot of principles inside. And we thought if we wanted to change something, we had to create a company. Sneaker was the product that crystallizes a lot of society problems. Big brands are lowering the costs of production in very poor countries with raw materials that are not ecological at all. That's why we started something different. We are in the state of Acre, in Brazil, where we buy the wild rubber. And we're following a seringueiro, a guy who is scratching the trees to take the rubber without damaging the tree, of course. It's the most ecological rubber on the planet because it comes directly from the forest without chemicals. We buy this wild rubber to put in every single sole of Veja sneakers. We buy almost 200 tons a year on fair trade principles, almost 3 times what it's worth on the market. This is approximately 1 pair of shoe.
The innovation of Veja's work with the rubber tappers here in the Amazon is dialogue.
Hoje, nós temos a borracha, ele é fundamental para a gente dar uma resposta para o não desmatamento da floresta na Amazônia.
The biggest enemy in Amazonia is cattle. They are cutting the forest to have cattle there, to increase their revenues, their quality of life, how to give new alternatives to cattle. This is the key.
We try to say to the seringueiros, you're going to make more money to take rubber from the trees than to cut down the forest. Because those guys, they can be the destroyers of the forest, or they can be the guardians of the forest. a decent wage. So at the end of the day, a Veja sneaker costs 4 to 7 times more than a common sneaker to manufacture. But for the public, it's almost the same price of a common sneaker. The big brands put a lot of resources into the marketing, but we refuse to do any advertising. We decided to put all the resources into the product. So the price of Veja is the real price of the shoes.
The beauty of something is not only its aesthetics, it's also the idea of the thing that you are looking at. The concept, the way it was thought, the way it was built. It's the whole process that you receive when you look at something.
This is my favorite place in the world. Forest. Magical. This tree has been cut for 100 years and she's still here. It's like a mother that gives us the milk to maintain people, to maintain the forest, to maintain the climate for the health of the world. This tree is very important for this.
Veja started like an adventure. All our friends, they say, yeah, you're crazy, you're setting up a sneaker brand, it's so difficult, you don't know anything about the fashion industry, the sneaker industry.
But we had an idea, and I think we had the power of conviction that through business you can actually make a difference on people's lives.
Wanting to do that. Oops. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. So that is the story of Esha. I always find it really inspiring. It's still owned by Sebastian and Francois. They bootstrapped it all the way. And they're just really interesting people who believe that business can be a force for good. So that's one example of a regenerative business, but I'd love to share some more quickly with you as well. Satex is a company that you may not have heard of, but you may have heard of the brands that they're manufacturing for. So Satex is manufacturing for Everlane, for Madewell, for Outerknown, but what they're doing is they're making jeans without using a lot of water. And the gentleman who started at Sanjeev, their kind of flagship factory has been in Vietnam. They said, can we rethink a factory? Like, can we make manufacturing regenerative? So they've been able to recycle any water that they do use. They've reduced the amount of water drastically. They've also put in a farm next to the factory where they grow the food that is then fed to the employees and the staff. They have incredible medical support for their employees, particularly for women as they go into maternal care. And they've all been able to do it within the economics of the fashion industry, which is also really important, much like Veja's example is like, we can't come up with just very premium brands that are very expensive. It needs to be, cost effective as well. And so it's really challenging people is that how do we make all of this work within the economics of what the consumer can also reasonably afford? So Satex is another fascinating example that you can perhaps learn more about if you go online. They also now have a facility in Los Angeles, and they're trying to do this in the United States in a very different kind of context. But that's on the manufacturing side. Another example is Gallant International. And they have a brand that's called TerraThread, which actually makes these backpacks and accessories. So Gallant's story is really interesting. They're based in Southern California, started by a Nepali immigrant who came to the States. And he was working in the apparel and kind of the accessories, private label space. And he saw that, look, there's a way that we could help farmers through this. We could really create a supply chain that's doing more than just sourcing from some, unknown facility in Asia, and really build more of a relationship. So he's building now the largest regenerative organic certified supply chain in cotton. They have over 900 farmers that are certified regenerative organic, and they're trying to do all types of products that are made out of cotton using regenerative organic cotton. Again, at price points that are reasonable. So it's not going to be 5x or 10x the cost of conventional cotton. I think it's another story of a smaller sized business that is able to put these practices into effect. Again, also bootstrapped, interestingly enough, and haven't taken on any money. The TerraThread brand that they have is also looking at backpacks and accessories, because when they looked at the landscape, they were like, everything's made of polyester, which has its challenges. Can we make it out of cotton? And so you can actually take their products and like bury them in the soil and they would break down, aside from a metal zipper. So that's really the philosophy of some of these brands, is how do we clean up these supply chains, build more personal relationships with the people that we're sourcing from. And regenerative agriculture is one aspect of it. So if you aren't familiar with the world of regenerative agriculture that's kind of sweeping the headlines these days, the transition to regenerative ag is not a new concept. I mean, communities have been doing it for years and years in smaller scale, but how do we scale this up to industrial farming and to larger scale farming? So a regenerative farm would really look at intercropping. They would look at the role of animals on the farm. It's not that you just grow produce in one section or just grow a crop and then animals are not involved. You would look at agroforestry. You would look at how the soil health is always being prioritized, not just to sequester carbon, but also to have a lot of nutrients. You may have heard that, these kind of figures that we only have 50 or 60 years of topsoil left in the Midwest. And so there's numerous farmers that are now looking at regenerative ag in the Midwest, and how do we scale it up, which I'll get into in a second here. So the book looks at a variety of other industries, as I mentioned. So if you dig into the book, you can find examples in food, plastics, travel, finance, health, amongst many. Food is a really interesting one. I know we all are very passionate about what we eat. So there's an example in there of Falcon Coffees, which is a importer-exporter. And when we think of middlemen or tradespeople, we're like, oh, they're the fat that we need to get rid of. But this coffee company, they've really figured out how to be able to take some of that money and really put it back into the coffee farms that they're working with. It's very hard to get financing for coffee farms. The kind of loans that they're getting are at 18, 20, 25%, crazy prices. So they're trying to figure out financing for farming, for coffee farming. And they work with Blue Bottle, Stumptown, Verve, many of the third wave roasters that you may have heard of, Allegro Coffee as well. There's an example in the book in chocolate, which is a brand out of Australia called Loving Earth, and they've built an incredible supply chain in Peru, and it's working entirely with indigenous communities as well as with indigenous communities in Australia. And then the one that I think everybody loves to hear about, which is beer. How do we make this, conversation around regeneration and sustainability and all of that exciting and interesting? And so this food waste activist from the UK, he decided to start a beer brand, and he noticed that in the UK, especially if you go to London, you see a lot of Pretz and a lot of those small corner shops where you can pick up a sandwich. Well, the end slices of those loaves are often trashed because nobody wants to use them in the sandwich. So he's like, well, let's make beer out of it and stop wasting this stuff. And so they went up to a brewery in Yorkshire and they started a beer brand called Toast Ale. And Toast is now available across the country in supermarkets and pubs and cafes. So again, a really great example of turning something that's like a waste material into something that can be consumed and gets people interested in the conversation around sustainability and regeneration. So that's Toast there. You can see their operation. And, people have been making beer with bread since the Roman times. And they were just like, well, why don't we do this anymore? Why don't we open source this recipe and share it with other people as well that want to do it? So that's another fun example of a regenerative business. This is one that's much closer to home for all of us. This is in Idaho. You can see here Tim Corney in the red shirt, and down here as well on the left. Tim Corney is a third-generation farmer in Idaho, and I was out there in September visiting him and getting to learn about his business. So 1000 Springs Mill is really interested in building this incredible regenerative agriculture supply chain in the US, in Idaho, and focusing on grains, beans, popcorn, things that are just essential pantry staples, and how do we lead this kind of transformation in agriculture in the US, where it's very different than perhaps in Asia or in Africa, where you're looking at more smallholder farmers, whereas in the US we're looking at much large-scale farming. So it's a real focus on like improving soil health, making it economically viable for farmers to do this. So he's got 1,000 acres where he's growing this buckwheat, which you can see in the photos there. And that's going to go into a granola brand called Little Bucks, which I believe is out of Minnesota, if I remember correctly. And they are trying to figure out different avenues of how do we get these ingredients into mainstream brands and into hands of consumers at accessible prices. So that's an example that's closer to home. And then this is another one that I had the opportunity to report on for Time earlier this year around December, January. And it's really interesting story. So when we look at these products, one of the big pushbacks is like, it's expensive, you can only do it if you have a really premium product, you can only do it at a small scale. And this gentleman by the name of Peter Bick, who's down at Arizona State University, and he's doing a bunch of research with ranchers across the US. So I spoke to many of the ranchers that he's been looking at their operations and studying for the last 5-7 years. This is the story, this lady there, it's a husband and wife duo that actually have a herd of 5,000 cattle and are doing AMP grazing, which is a sort of regenerative approach to multi-paddock grazing. And they're finding that the economics of it is why they're so excited about it. The environmental benefit is great, it's great that it's much better for their soils, they're seeing improvement on their grasslands. But really, they were like, we're saving $50,000 a year because we're not buying nitrogen, we're saving on feed, we're saving on so many different places where it makes up for any additional labor costs that may be involved. And so if you're interested in reading the story, you can find it on Time. And it looks at ranchers across the US that are really taking up regenerative agriculture from an economic perspective. And I think that's where this conversation starts to get interesting, is like, how do we align the environmental goals with the business goals? And the two have to be in sync. So that's 5,000 cattle. The average herd in the United States is about under 100 cattle. It's in fact even less than that, it's around 50. So the fact that they can sort of do this at a much larger scale is promising for how do we get more businesses on board. And then I'd love to just talk through 3 different topics that came up in the book. So regenerative businesses are really rethinking waste and employee ownership. And so we talked about Toast Ale, which was the example of rethinking waste, is like, turning something that people don't want into something that people actually really want, beer. But another example in regenerative businesses is really around how do we share the wealth? Like, we don't need to all just hoard the wealth to ourselves. And so how do we create employee ownership more accessible? How do we get people involved that might not have an opportunity to build a business themselves, to buy, a part of that business? And so I'd love to share with you, this one is Technicians for Sustainability. They're in Arizona. It's a husband and wife team that started this company, and they are at 73 employees now. They do solar installations for folks around the Southwest region, and this could be commercial, it could be residential. And when I was talking to them, they said, what we noticed was that the folks that are actually doing the work and helping us transition to renewable energy are not going to be making a lot of money off of it. I mean, in addition to getting paid an hourly salary, an hourly wage, or a salary, they're not really benefiting from this transition. How do we allow them to be a part of this success? And so I have an update from them because I touched base with them just a couple weeks ago, and they created an employee ownership model. So after 1 year of work, anybody can apply to be an owner of the company, have a share of the company. There's 29 current owners. There are a few that have even successfully retired and are now paying out their equity over 5 years. And 40% of profits each year still go to all the employees. So it's not even that they've just decided to create, an employee ownership model. It's that they're really allocating a huge part of the success of the company to the employees. That's another part of the regenerative mindset. It's like, it's not just doing one aspect that makes you kind of tick a box that say, okay, social impact done or environmental impact done. But it's like, how do we keep layering that? And so if we go back to Toast actually for a second, Toast has this model where they turn all their profits back into a food waste nonprofit. So they take out whatever their expenses are, pay their salaries, all their operating costs, and then they take those profits and they put it back into a food waste nonprofit. And so that's furthering this cause of how do we reduce food waste. So I think that that's a really important aspect of this, as well as how do we share this growth and this wealth. This was a story that I believe was in the Wall Street Journal last year, and this has been a real topic of discussion, and it's less relevant to, I think, small businesses and even medium-sized businesses, but large companies. We've seen this real discrepancy, right, between the top and the average worker, and it's caused a lot of friction. And so how do we create some more equity in there? Companies are taking different approaches. So you've seen Technicians for Sustainability, they're doing an employee ownership model or an ESOP model. There's other models, which is where a company will decide that the executive will only get paid 5x, 4x, whatever the term is, 6x, more than the average employee. And what was interesting was, as I was digging into this, I found that there are businesses that have been doing this for decades and we just don't talk about it. So there's a company in Vermont called Chroma Technology. They've been around since the 80s, and they have this in place where they had, specific figures for executives that were sort of maxed out every year. And they've just been adjusting it for inflation and for cost of living as it's gone up. But they've been practicing this philosophy of like, we're not going to be having these huge discrepancies. We're going to keep it more attainable. Vivo Barefoot, a shoe brand that's also in the book, is doing this in the UK as well by being very mindful of what they pay their executives versus their staff. So it's another thing to just think about is like, how do we create more equity in this space? And you can really do that through your business. This leads us to our discussion. But before we get to our discussion, I just want to go back to this slide really quick. The last big theme that came out of all of this reporting is this question of enough. And I think it really speaks to the financial piece as well. Is that how much is enough? Like, how much is enough for you personally in your life? How much is enough for you as a business owner? And it's that question of scale, right? Like, we can do regenerative businesses at 200, 300 million. We've seen that with Veja. We've seen that with other examples in the world. We haven't seen it yet with publicly traded companies, and I think everybody's sort of waiting to see, can somebody crack that model at a much larger level where you also have the demand every quarter to maximize profits. So that would be interesting, but it's this theme that came out of like this question of enough. And Sebastian and Francois Veja, they often have said this. They say, like, we feel like replication is the answer. We don't want to be the next Nike. We want to have dozens and dozens of Vejas in the world across different geographies. So we want to see an American one, we want to see an Asian one, we want to see a South American one. And I think that that's really the philosophy of the book, as well as of the kind of reporting I do, which is if we're going to bridge this gap in business, we have to have a real conversation of like, how much is enough? So that brings us to the questions and the discussion. The idea here is that I'm sure you're seated alongside some lovely people that perhaps you've been chatting with, but can you think of a regenerative business model that you would like to build, maybe taking inspiration from some of the examples that we just discussed, or even one that already exists that you can tell your friends about, your colleagues about? And also, what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities that are facing building businesses such as these? We kind of touched on some of these themes in terms of financing it, scaling it, the human capital component of all of this. But we'd love to dedicate 10, 15 minutes for you to have this discussion amongst yourself and then share, and then there'll be an opportunity, I believe, for Q&A. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Esha. I will set the timer and I'll call everyone back in about 15 minutes. All right, we're going to move on to share outs here. guys were devising your regenerative business model. Anybody want to volunteer?
Don't be shy.
A regenerative business model that already exists, that you've seen and appreciate in the community. I know there was one over here that you guys were talking about. I overheard that. I might have to volunteer you. Or one that you would like to see. Okay, looks like we got one. Nice. Thank you.
All right, hello, it's on. All right, we stole one that we saw in the presentation, so we want to bring toast beer to Madison. And also, we want to add on to it and produce some of our own food and then use that waste from that food, like potatoes, to make our own vodka and fruits to make our own wine. We already have a brewmaster, friend of a friend. And our location has been vacant on East Washington for about 6 months, so we know they're primed for the taking at a low, low price. And our biggest challenge is just going to be buying all the brewing equipment and getting it on site.
Thank you so much. That's great. You're being good company.
I can just chime in and say that if you are seriously considering it, Toast Ale would be happy to mentor you through the process, and we can make that connection.
All right, one more. Creative ideas. I know this is a creative group here. All right, one in the back.
Howdy again. So this isn't necessarily my creative idea, but it's an idea that I support 100%. And it is started by a friend of mine. His name is William. He lives in Colombia, and he bought a forest in order to preserve it, because right now there's an issue with basically a rapid elimination of the whole rainforest. So, and he bought it. And his idea is to call it Ultima Bosque. It started right now. You can actually look it up, Ultima Bosque, which translates into the last forest. And he is providing information about showing how it is necessary to keep that going and not just kind of running for the next profit, you know. So definitely check it out. He's really, really an interesting character, and he's taking on a task that's, if you know anything about Colombia, it's basically not one of their prime concerns. So, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one question. Do we have a question for Esha? Burning question from the audience? Maybe about employee ownership?
Yeah, we got one back here.
Oh, cool. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I'm afraid I got here a little bit late, but what I didn't hear mentioned during the presentation is cooperative business, which worker ownership can be a significant type of co-op, but it's not the only type. And for folks that are looking for a model that is still enterprise, but has that sort of associational aspect, I just encourage folks to learn more about that. And I wondered if you had a chance to study or look into those, right? Because you can have consumer-owned model like the food co-ops, credit unions, REI, right? You can have the worker co-op model, which like here in Madison, people might know Union Cab or Isthmus Manufacturing. But some of the big producer agriculture companies, right, are big businesses, but those profits are still going back to rural communities, and the ownership is still with farmers. And so I think sometimes we forget that there's a business model that's been around like since the 1800s that is sort of the original regenerative business model, not always with a sustainability focus, but often with a sustainability focus, and that fits, sort of checks a lot of these boxes. So I'm curious if you found some examples of those as well in your work.
Yes, absolutely. I think if the co-ops are done with right intention and the money is actually distributed to all the owners, it can certainly work. So Gallant International, the company that I mentioned, they work with a co-op that's specifically in cotton in their supply chain, and they're really passionate about how do they go beyond just the financial benefits, but also creating a community that can support each other through a variety of other challenges. So it could be, medical care, it could be for women any specific needs that they have. So there's definitely an opportunity there with co-ops in supply chains. There's also this understanding with co-ops that, I mean, it's usually seen in kind of models where you have, like you said, a brand or a larger entity, but there's also now co-ops coming about in energy, which are really interesting. So there's an example in the book called Economist, which is in France, and they're looking at like if we're going to be putting turbines or we're going to be putting solar panels or whatever, hydropower that you're yielding from somebody's farm or land, can they then get some of the benefits of that? And so Economist has created these co-ops in energy, which we haven't seen as many of, I would say. So they've got a really interesting model, and you can read about that in the book as well. But yes, co-ops are also part of the story if they're executed well.
All right, thank you so much, Esha. And if we get one last round of applause for Dane.
Thank you all for having me. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I hope you do find the book interesting, and if you do, please reach out and get in touch. LinkedIn, email, ask the folks at Sustain Dane, they'll connect you. I would really love to hear from all of you. So thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Esha. I personally loved it, so I would encourage everyone to check it out.
Thank you.
All right, and up next we have our Live Forward Awards, which will be introduced by Mario, and I will change the slides for you over here. Thank you.